Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening for a what I know will be enlightening and moving and rewarding discussion to talk about an important part of Salem's history as we kick off our 250th year here at Salem Academy and College. It is my privilege to welcome you tonight to the inaugural event of our Anna Maria Samuels project that we are conducting this year to talk about race, to remember, and to talk about reconciliation of our history here at Salem. What I wanted to share with you tonight before I introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Martha Hartley, is to share with you some thoughts about this evening's event and what it means, I think, to our Salem community and what it means to me. I think the most important part of what we will accomplish here this evening is the piece of remembrance. Remembering names that have been forgotten for a long time, remembering experiences and a period of time in our history that had been erased and is now brought back to life through the amazing work and the historical research of our students, our now alumni, and members of our academic community. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us as a community, not just here at Salem, but the broader Winston-Salem community, to acknowledge and to remember our history with slavery and to acknowledge the meaningful lives of those enslaved persons that contributed across this community here in Salem as well as across Winston-Salem. I also want to acknowledge tonight that as we begin our time together and have this discussion, that the land on which we stand here tonight, this land was once the home of the Catawba and the Chirwa tribes. Today, we acknowledge that our institution was founded on traditional lands of the Catawba and Chirwa peoples, and we pay our respect and offer appreciation to elders both past and present. It is also their story and their names and their traditions that ought to be respected and remembered this evening as well. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the remarkable dedication and work of the Anna Maria Samuels Project committee members, many of whom are with us here tonight. Reverend Dr. Amy Rio, who is a co-chair of the Anna Maria Samuels Project, as well as Michelle Hopkins Lawrence, also a co-chair of this project, and countless students and alumni and staff at this institution that have worked tirelessly to bring these stories to life. It is so, so important that this work has been done. Salem has been recognized as a leader among our women's college colleagues, as someone that is doing really important work, and it is thanks to your work and dedication that we are able to have this event and many others tonight. So thank you again for joining us this evening here at Salem. It is my pleasure to welcome you here, and it is also my pleasure to welcome Martha Hartley tonight to speak with us and to share her perspectives and her work. Martha Hartley is the Director of Moravian Research at Old Salem Museum and Gardens. She is a native of Winston-Salem and received undergraduate degrees from Hollins College and spent a year in Paris during college. From the University of Virginia, she received a master's degree in urban planning and a certificate in historic preservation. Her work as a preservation planner has included community preservation, advocacy, and public awareness. For over 35 years, Martha and her husband Michael, an anthropologist and director of archaeology emeritus at Old Salem, have worked together with the archaeology, history, landscape, and preservation of the Moravian communities in the Winston-Salem area. They have been honored for their work, most recently in April with the David Schnatscheider Award for Excellence from the Center of Moravian Studies in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. At Old Salem, she is also co-chair of the Hidden Town Project to research and reveal the history of people of African descent in Salem. Resting on previous work at the museum, the Hidden Town Project is research-driven and focused on identifying people, building their biographies, and understanding the lives within the white Moravian world, as well as the continuum of history through their descendants. In addition to research, community engagement remains a critical component of the Hidden Town Project through collaboration, education, and public awareness. Their history recognizes that African-born and derived people are among the founders and builders of Winston-Salem. We thank you for joining us tonight to share your research and your work, and we look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you for being here with us in our community tonight as we begin to celebrate and acknowledge our history and think about how our history informs our future. Martha Hartley.
Thank you so much, President McGee. It's an honor to be with you all tonight and share a little bit of the work that we've been doing at Old Salem. I'm taking my mask off. It feels so good. All right, let's see. Molly's got me set up here, and you all can hear me. So I'm delighted and appreciative of the invitation to be a part of this recognition and honor of people of African descent in the school's history. Salem Academy and College is inherently part of the Salem and broader Wachovia story. This place is the origin of modern-day Winston-Salem, a city built by European-born and derived people and African-born and derived people. 5 years ago, Old Salem's incoming president, Frank Vagnoni, recognized the museum's longtime commitment to hard history and initiated the Hidden Town Project. Our local history is complicated, but it is legacy. Let's review how we got here. Winston-Salem is a vibrant city of 250,000 people in Forsyth County. Salem's antique buildings are prominent in the foreground here. Called the City of Arts and Innovation, Winston-Salem gets its credentials from the Moravian Church, which began building the community in the 1750s. Archival records tell us much. Today, the Salem in Winston-Salem is Old Salem, a National Register or a National Historic Landmark tourist destination and 90-acre neighborhood with residences, Moravian Church entities, Salem Academy and College, and the oldest standing African-American church in North Carolina. St. Philip's Moravian Church is a remarkable touchstone of the Black experience in Winston-Salem. They are spiritual descendants of one of the oldest African-American congregations of any denomination in the United States and will celebrate their 200th anniversary next year. Significant in American history, St. Philip's has been engaged by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. There is local interest in the deep history as well. St. Philip's is the only historic Black Moravian church in the United States. This contrasts the worldwide Moravian Church, which is majority people of color, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, from centuries of missionary work. Global church leaders convened in Winston-Salem in 2018 and visited St. Philip's. St. Philip's uniqueness is the story of the Moravian Church in the American South. A formal apology for slavery was made in 2006. Reconciliation is the hard part. This ancient Protestant church has origins in 15th century Bohemia and the philosophy of John Huss, whose followers established the Unitas Fratrum. At the same time, Portuguese ships seeking gold in Africa began filling their holds with human cargo. New World labor needs then fueled the transatlantic slave trade. In America, land was stolen from native peoples and exploited for wealth creation through the labor of kidnapped, enslaved Africans. Crimes against humanity of epic proportion and with durable impact. In the 1730s, the renewed Moravian Church in Europe embarked on global mission work, beginning with enslaved people in the West Indies and extending to Greenland, South America, and Africa. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was the first permanent Moravian congregation in North America, and in 1753 they purchased 100,000 acres in the backcountry of Piedmont, North Carolina, and named it Wachovia. Although the Moravians had encountered Native Americans in their land search across North Carolina, indigenous people had already been pushed from the Wachovia land. We must acknowledge the sin of colonialization, subjugation, and land theft. Wachovia was 250 miles from the sea, but positioned to trade via overland routes. Moravians were excellent planners and created an unparalleled place in 18th century America. The beginning was made at Bethabara, then Bethania, then the central town of Salem. Ambitious Moravian plans were constrained by a small population, and renting labor, white and black, was a solution that brought them into direct relationship with enslaved people. European architecture was transplanted to early Wachovia. The Single Brothers House in Salem was completed in 1769, the year the Wachovia Moravians began their role as enslaver. A teenager called Sam was rented in Bethabara. A skilled cattle handler who showed an inclination for conversion, he was offered for sale by his owner. The lot approved the purchase of Sam, who was baptized as Johannes Samuel. He became a Moravian single brother, a spiritual equal, who was owned by his brothers. He returned to Bethabara, where he later married. His first child was Anna Maria Samuel. During the colonial period, 6 Moravian congregations were established in Wachovia that have grown into 30 Moravian churches in Forsyth County today. Non-Moravians also bought land in Wachovia. The map on the right shows Forsyth County with the Wachovia tract at its core. Winston-Salem city limits are shown in pink, and they nearly fill the Wachovia Moravian tract. Wachovia and Winston-Salem are deeply related. Free and enslaved people of African descent contributed to the building and function of Wachovia. Salem was a theocratic town where slave ownership was limited to the church, with the hope of keeping enslaved numbers low and the Moravian work ethic high. Like most religious groups in America, the Moravians did not object to slavery, but regarded one's place in life as ordained, with salvation the key. A small number of enslaved people chose conversion and were considered spiritual equals. This integrated fellowship included worship and burial practices as well as educational opportunities. Sambo was purchased for the Salem Tannery in 1771. He resisted twice, was punished, and nearly sold, but later sought conversion. Baptized as Abraham, he became a communicant Moravian. A respected tradesman, Abraham remained enslaved, but in death, spiritual equality buried him in God's acre. Graveyards hold stories, well-known, little-known, and unknown. Salem was a town of artisans, a doctor was in residence, and music was central to this religious community that sought separation from the outsiders, but commerce meant dealings with non-Moravians. The Salem Tavern was interface and operated with enslaved workers as maids, field hands, hostlers, waiters for kitchen work and housework from its opening in 1772. A school for Salem girls was also started in 1772 when teacher Elizabeth Ersteline moved from Bethabara. Today, Salem Academy and College is the oldest institution of higher learning for women and girls in America and endures as legacy of commitment to an educated populace, as promoted by Czech Moravian philosopher John Amos Comenius. In 1785, permission was granted for an enslaved girl from a nearby farm to attend the school, but it is unclear if she did. The American Revolution nurtured fresh ideas about individual freedom. Labor shortages prompted renting labor, and increasing numbers of black people, free and enslaved, normalized that presence. Households increasingly requested to rent enslaved women and girls for childcare and domestic needs. Enslaved people in Wachovia were often moved from one community to another. Salem looked like this when Peter Oliver was moved here from Bethania. Even as a rented teenager, he directed his life towards freedom. A communicant Moravian, he is remembered for his role in the pottery, especially the shop of Rudolph Christ, husband of Sister Ersteline. Although there is no attributable work by Peter Oliver, it is no doubt that his skillful hands contributed to the operation. Free in 1800, he married and leased a farm for his family. Invisible under 200 years' development, the site is designed by the important landscape architect Walter Hood, and history is playing a prominent role in his design. Peter Oliver was buried in God's acre not far from Abraham. There are many descendants, and you may recognize NBA All-Star Chris Paul. Peter Oliver was one of 2 or 3 enslaved Moravians who lived in the Single Brothers House. Anna Maria Samuel is the only known Afro-Moravian to have lived in the Single Sisters House, and the namesake for the Remembrance Project. She was the oldest child of Johann and Maria Samuel in Bethabara and moved to Salem to enter the older girls' choir and attended school. Her experience was unique, however, as the idea of spiritual equality was framed. A church board reported, quote, "It was mentioned that we must not be ashamed of those Negroes who belong to our community, and as happened before, let them sit all by themselves in the congregational worshipings and even during Holy Communion. They are our brothers and sisters, and different treatment of them will degrade ourselves to the rank of ordinary people in this world and will be a disgrace for the community," end quote. Acculturation was the topic of last fall's Renolda Conference. Population in the Moravian Tract continued to grow. In 1800, Wachovia was part of Stokes County, where the census counted 1,439 slaves, 63 of whom were in Wachovia. Regular segregated services had begun in outlying congregations. The Salem town lot is highlighted here in yellow and was about 2 miles across. Gottlieb Schober established a paper mill along Peters Creek, which powered the mill. The human power came from enslaved people. Since the operation was outside of town, slave rules did not apply. Timothy and Fanny were born in Africa and enslaved by Schober. Timothy died at over 100, but never learned to speak English well, interpreted as a sign of resistance. He and Fanny were buried in the Negro God's Acre in Salem. They have many descendants. Historian Spencer McCall is working on a book about the family, and his cousin Lucretia Carter Berry devotes herself to racism awareness. I recommend her TED Talk. Genealogy is a vital link, and we work with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. At this year's Juneteenth Festival, we highlighted genealogy. In 1800, new church architecture signaled changing styles and attitudes. By this time, Black people were being held at the door or turned away, as segregation of worship gained traction. The girls' boarding school brought new dynamics. Moravian schools were renowned the world over, and non-Moravian families persisted in asking for a boarding school in Salem, as education for girls was rare in the South. In 1804, the first students arrived, and demand was steady. By 1810, enslaved labor was purchased and rented to support school needs. Born in Africa, Phoebe and Bodney were an enslaved Afro-Moravian couple who were purchased with several of their children. They were placed at the Negro quarter for church-owned slaves, located out of town where Bodney was farm manager. The farm was one of several growing up around Salem where the slave rules did not apply. Their daughter Betsy was about 10 when she was purchased for the girls' school in 1811 by Inspector Steiner. Sam was a rented enslaved man at the Single Sisters house. After several years, fears of their association prompted their removal to a nearby farm. In 1817, Betsy and Sam were wed, and their first child was born the next year. Slavery in Salem was generational. Although the Atlantic slave trade had ended by act of Congress in 1807, there were already over 1 million slaves in the United States, and the domestic trade became robust. Phoebe's infant was the last person of African descent buried in God's Acre. An 1816 decision to accommodate boarding school students' relatives in God's Acre prompted the end of Afro-Moravian burials there, and the segregated Negro God's Acre was established at the former parish graveyard. The boarding school was constantly pressed to accommodate more girls. Labor demands were great, as the laundry hearth size suggests. Following Betsy and Sam, a series of enslaved individuals were purchased by or for the school and the Single Sisters. In 2017, students here protested, demanding to know the role of slavery at Salem. The school embarked on a discovery process, joined universities studying slavery, and established the Anna Maria Samuel Project. Currently, Salem chaplain Amy Rio and I are working with the local USS committee to plan a 2022 symposium. The mapping exercise indicates concentrations of enslaved people growing up outside of town, circled in red. Although regulations prohibited residents from keeping their enslaved people in town, they remained in force. Some residents continually pushed against the rules. The sacred segregated completely in 1822 when a Christian congregation was organized for enslaved people at the urging of the Salem Female Missionary Society. Abraham Steiner was pastor. The women funded the log church built adjacent to the new graveyard. In this painting, home church is at the far left, and the Negro church is at the far right. At a December 1824 service, Betsy was confirmed in the new church. She and Sam were members of the Negro congregation. At the reconstructed log church, stories are told through art. The free Christian Samuel was an accomplished musician who often led church music. Educated in Bethabara, he worked for the Single Sisters in their household management. The Salem Moravians had begun mission work to the Cherokee in Spring Place, Georgia in 1801. Daughters of 2 Cherokee chiefs attended Salem Academy, including Sally Ridge on the right. During Sally's first year in Salem, she likely knew Christian Samuel through his work in the Single Sisters house. Christian died at age 29 and was buried in the Negro God's Acre. Entrepreneurship drove industrialization in early 19th century Salem. The grist mill in the foreground was built in 1820 with private money and without the church. A banking agency established in 1815 would evolve into Wachovia Bank after the Civil War. An 1831 state law required militias, as fears of slave rebellions prompted such readiness in North Carolina. At times, slave patrols were organized in Salem. In addition, new state law prohibited teaching slaves to read or write, but arithmetic continued at the school. This painting views Salem from the outlying farm of town doctor Henry Schumann in the foreground. He lived across Salem Creek and ran a successful farm using enslaved people. In 1836, he decided to move into town, where slave regulations prohibited bringing his enslaved people. He manumitted 17 people and sent them with 6 others to Liberia in West Africa. After emancipation, this landscape of Dr. Schumann's farm was developed as Happy Hill, the first African-American neighborhood in Winston-Salem. At our 2019 landscape conference, landscape architect and Professor Kofi Boone keynoted with "Black Landscapes Matter." Landscapes mattered when the Liberia-Salem connection was revealed in Happy Hill through the city's historic marker program, made possible with Old Salem's research. Major industry was established in the 1830s with one of the first cotton mills in the state, soon followed by the Freeze woolen mill, where much enslaved labor was used. The rules about slaveholding were increasingly challenged. This detail is from a painting by Academy teacher Maria Steiner, often called Polly, who was a daughter of Inspector Steiner. The full painting shows her home and garden, where Betsy and Sam were later enslaved. The 1850 census indicated that Betsy was living there. Interestingly, in the 1860 census, a grandniece of Anna Maria Samuel lived there as well, and her name was Sophia Mitchell, and she was a free person. Salem Academy had a perpetual need for space and took possession of the Gammon House in 1840. The east side of Salem Square was the face of the school. Slavery in Salem was urban slavery, but out in Wachovia there were large farms and plantations which depended on enslaved labor. Bethania had a large enslaved population. Betty Coger was born on the Conrad Jones plantation in Bethania. She was recorded in a WPA interview in the 1930s. As in Salem, a congregation for the enslaved population had been formed in Bethania, but after emancipation, the church became Bethania AME Zion Church. Descendants of Bethania's enslaved population continue to live around the town. A historic marker acknowledges their heritage, but much work remains to be done there. My own Moravian roots are in Bethania through my grandmother, whose 4 sisters were Salem College alumni. My grandmother died before my birth, but I remember well my great Aunt Ruthie, shown here, about the time she was studying music at Salem. Some of our ancestors were enslavers in Bethania. Mid-century brought sweeping changes. In 1847, Salem's slave regulations were abolished as unenforceable. Not every Moravian was a slave owner, but numbers increased. There remained those who opposed slavery as well. Forsyth County was created out of Stokes in 1849, and Salem sold 51 acres for the new county seat named Winston. Columns and hoop skirts recall the Old South. The figures may not all be Moravian, but the scene reflects a southern town. Around this time, Salem leadership ended the theocracy, and the landscape immediately changed when Salem Cemetery was created. 2 years later, a contiguous segregated burial ground was established. Phoebe died in 1861 and was buried in the new graveyard. The WA on her marker indicated that she was owned by the Wachovia administration. The Salem congregation is uplifting this St. Philip II graveyard through grave identification and marking. Sam was buried there. In 1860, the federal census described Forsyth County with a 14% enslaved population. Approximately 135 men, women, and children were enslaved by Salem residents, including 47 at the Freeze Mill. The slave schedule also enumerated about 35 slave houses in Salem. Research indicates these were likely outbuildings with other primary uses, like a kitchen, a laundry, or a shop. None survive. The laundry here in this photograph is speculated as housing for an enslaved girl in the 1860s. Other enslaved people lived in their enslaver's home. The 1860 federal census slave schedule tells us much. It is likely the 37-year-old male is David Schober, who probably lived in the brick kitchen shown. David and his wife, Betsy Ann, were associated with the Negro congregation, but owned by different people. She was enslaved on the nearby Wall plantation. Their son, James Francis Schober, went on to greatness. He graduated from Lincoln University, followed by medical school at Howard University, and he became a highly respected physician in Wilmington, North Carolina. He died at the young age of 35, leaving a wife and 2 daughters. It is said that he worked himself to death as the only black physician in a city with over 10,000 African Americans. At the start of the Civil War, a large brick church was built for the Negro congregation, known as the African Church in Salem. Academy Assistant Principal Maximilian de Grunert was pastor during the war. In March 1865, an act of resistance by an enslaved woman in his household led to a poisoning. Jane wanted to return to Bethania and confessed to targeting de Grunert's wife, but a child was unintentionally killed. Union troops occupied Salem that spring, and freedom was announced to a packed church on May the 21st, 1865. Freedmen prioritized education for their children and negotiated with Salem trustees for land. It was provided on the former Schumann Farm, where freedmen built a school. A historic marker in Happy Hill recalls this significant history. The Schumann Farm figured prominently in the landscape of freedom. Some Salem residents objected to freedmen buying property in town, and church trustees settled on a segregated solution across the creek. They began development of a little town they called Liberia, with lots available to freedmen for $10 each. Soon known as Happy Hill, it was the first African-American neighborhood in Winston-Salem. The Happy Hill Cemetery is recorded with more than 1,500 burials. However, part of the cemetery was taken by Highway 52. Over time, the sacred ground was lost in tangles and vandalism, and Maurice Pitts Johnson sought assistance from Old Salem Archaeology. Retrieval was launched in 2010, and Mrs. Johnson continues work with volunteers. Her grandparents were early Happy Hill residents who were buried there. In our expansion of the Old Salem National Historic Landmark District, we were able to make the case for including a portion of Happy Hill, that which had been tested archaeologically. The South collapsed with defeat in the Civil War, but Salem's economy rebounded relatively quickly. Attracted to existing infrastructure and a new rail line, R.J. Reynolds came in 1874 to establish his tobacco empire. His offer of manufacturing work then brought many rural black people to Winston-Salem, boosting the black population to nearly 40% by the turn of the century. The girls' school was named Salem Female Academy by an 1866 Act of Incorporation. The preparatory and collegiate work was separated, and in 1890, Adelaide Fries was among the first class to receive BA degrees. She became the renowned Moravian archivist. The school grew eastwardly, and the vast pleasure grounds in the background became the academy location in 1930. The African Church was expanded in 1890 to meet educational demands of children and adults. The Atwood Sewing Circle and other church programs kept the black Moravians engaged. The small congregation consistently supported Moravian missionaries abroad. African Americans lived throughout Salem in duplexes, tenements, and single-family homes. The Sanborn insurance maps offer clues to long-gone housing. The tenements labeled Chris Bottom in the photograph are the tenements on the map. Note the diagonal street by the tenements, which is now a path through school grounds in the vicinity of the long-gone African American housing. The 1898 Democratic Party victory in North Carolina solidified white supremacy, and African Americans endured growing racism and overall injustices. Winston and Salem grew side by side until 1913, and they consolidated. In 1914, Bishop Rontaler named the congregation St. Philip's Moravian Church. Textiles and tobacco made Winston-Salem the largest and wealthiest city in North Carolina until the Great Depression. African Americans participated in the growing economy with an influx of new residents and professional opportunities. Winston-Salem State University was founded in 1892 by Simon Green Atkins in the Columbian Heights neighborhood. Black city residents included attorneys, physicians, dentists, ministers, factory workers, barbers, restaurant owners, grocers, funeral directors, chauffeurs, domestics, insurance agents, teachers, and others. Happy Hill grew steadily through the turn of the 20th century as a cohesive neighborhood. By 1920, about 130 families lived on the beautiful rolling landscape above the Salem Creek bottom. A new state charter in 1907 established Salem Academy and College, and expansion plans in the 1920s created the familiar campus of today. Cluel, Bidding, and the refectory were the major new buildings. The laundry scene during Cluel's construction emphasizes the enormous labor needs of the school. School employees included many African Americans. In dining services, Edith Limley Page and her brother-in-law, Clarence Page, are seen. Mrs. Page's grandfather was the first property owner in Happy Hill and a descendant of Phoebe and Bodney. Edith's husband, Sherman, was invaluable to the school as well. He was descended from Timothy and Fanny. At their Happy Hill home, Edith was photographed with two daughters who attended Sunday school at St. Philip's. This past Jan term, Michelle Lawrence's student, Michaela Murphy, researched the Page family for the Hidden Town Project, and alumna Jessie Bowman is pursuing further Happy Hill connections in her capstone project now. Like the Pages, many school employees lived in Happy Hill. Residents walked to their jobs at the school or to tobacco factories or to other employers. Access to Happy Hill required crossing Salem Creek, which was dangerous as the old bridge had washed away. The metal truss bridge was built through the perseverance of Happy Hill resident Wade Bidding and is a historic structure in use today. Mr. Bidding was also an advocate for Happy Hill Park and other important initiatives. Just last month, the historic bridge was named for Mr. Bidding in a formal ceremony with family members, dignitaries, proclamations, libations, and much celebration. Former Happy Hill resident Jonathan Serrano brought a community voice to the Hidden Town Project. He researched the Bidding family and conducted a descendant interview. We co-presented about Happy Hill at the Black History Month Genealogy Conference. A clip from the presentation shows Jonathan at the far right. The photograph shows Wade Bidding's wife, Josephine, and their son, Wade Jr. Mrs. Josephine Bidding was a longtime laundry employee at Salem Academy and College. Their daughter, Kathleen Bidding, was employed in dining services and is shown here with the chef, Russell Cruz. In the late 18th century, their Bidding ancestor, called Sterling, was enslaved in Germantown by Anthony Bidding, whose great-granddaughter, Kate Bidding Reynolds, funded the construction of Bidding Dorm. African-American presence in Salem is informed through city directories. Small yellow dots indicate households, large blue dots indicate numbers of households. Black people had lived in Salem since the colonial period, but Jim Crow laws and redlining changed all that. Salem became a segregated white neighborhood by the 1930s, and the black presence became a hidden town. St. Philip's is marked with the gold star. The congregation was at that site for more than 100 years when Old Salem, the museum, was established in 1950. St. Philip's had wanted to move for some decades, and they did so in 1952 under the leadership of Dr. Hall, their first minister of African descent. They moved across the creek to Happy Hill, where at the time the city's first public housing project, Happy Hill Gardens, was under construction. New people meant new possibility. Unfortunately, the best laid plans in a new church building were destroyed by the new Highway 52, and the congregation moved again to Bonnier Avenue. In 1968, the Reverend Dr. Cedric Rodney was the first ordained minister of African descent to lead the congregation. Since his retirement in 2003, St. Philip's has been without permanent clergy. Residential security maps, or redlining, were formal means of racial discrimination in the United States, where neighborhoods were graded for quality and desirability. The 1937 map of Winston-Salem shows African-American neighborhoods in red for D, the fourth grade, and the least desirable. In green is A, the first grade and most desirable neighborhoods of Buena Vista, West Highlands, and Westview. The implications were severe as black neighborhoods were highlighted as high risks and denied loans or fair loans, and homes were undervalued, all depriving African Americans of wealth building. Municipal infrastructure was withheld from black neighborhoods and led to disrepair, which often ended in demolition. Public policy targeted black neighborhoods for urban renewal and highway development. I've added the highway corridors to the redlining map, and you can see how Interstate 40 and US 52 blasted through stable African American neighborhoods in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The purple circle indicates Happy Hill, where Highway 52 took St. Philip's New Church, and where urban renewal demolished 14 city blocks for public housing. The new highway alignments were a connect-the-dot exercise across black neighborhoods through East Winston, Columbian Heights, Happy Hill, and further into Walltown Bellevue. Destruction included homes, businesses, churches, livelihoods, and social fabric. The first section of I-40 to open in North Carolina was the part through downtown, which eradicated the Blue Street neighborhood in East Winston. Barbara Morris is a St. Philip's Moravian who grew up in that neighborhood with her grandmother. Active in the civil rights movement, she continues to advocate for the neighborhood memory. When 52 was built, the highways intersected at the original location of the Blue Street neighborhood. This aerial looks across the eradication of place. US 52 remains a barrier and excludes East Winston from downtown's revitalization. Following George Floyd's murder last year, groundswell response prompted local demonstrations. A protest called out this highway history, and young activists occupied 52, shutting it down. One activist said, quote, "Nobody should live in this city and not know the truth," end quote. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the old St. Philip's Church building sat empty in Old Salem, until, one might say, the hand of God intervened. On Old Salem's anniversary day in 1989, a tornado damaged the church. Earnest efforts began to address this highly significant place and to understand the complicated history. Scholars worked through archival information and architects studied the damaged building. An early surprise were 20 gravestones under the church hall floor and 11 more behind the front steps. Archaeology determined the grave markers had been removed from the graveyard in 1913 for a beautification project. Archaeology is invaluable to understanding and revealing the graveyards, and without intrusion into burial. And although not trained as an archaeologist, I made good labor under the church in 1986. The graveyard's meaning and visibility are essential. Like the church, the land is sacred. In the Moravian tradition, St. Philip's sisters prepare the graveyard for Easter. Archival lists recorded 131 burials in the graveyards. Since nearly all are unidentified, a memorial plaque records the name and death date of each interred person. Mel White was Old Salem's first director of African American programming. The landmark Across the Creek exhibit in 1998 was his connection with descendants and other African American families in Happy Hill, gathering oral histories and photographs. We stand on Mr. White's shoulders in our research. The Church Restoration Project reestablished the relationship between Happy Hill and St. Philip's. St. Philip's was a $3 million capital campaign project for Old Salem. The log church was reconstructed to tell stories, and the brick church, a consecrated space, was restored. It has served many functions since the restoration. In 2019, the congregation made it their church home. The Hidden Town Project expands 3 decades of work. The project is research-driven, with many contributions from Salem Academy and college students. We work hard to identify people and build biographies, as well as to understand life within the white Moravian world. The work is also about community engagement, and the Hidden Town Project continues to advocate for revitalization of African American places, especially efforts in Happy Hill, including the Shotgun House Project. Public policy decisions have created trauma, as discussed, Hidden Town is supporting an upcoming webinar on racial justice and urban planning. The event is open to the public and will be held on November the 4th. Salem Academy and College shares the history that we all seek to understand. Truth is basic to the conversation. Economic inequality and oppression are embedded in our society. Racial disparities persist in housing, health, education, transportation, food systems, policing, and incarceration. Environmental racism has been tolerated, and voter suppression hampers democracy. Generational damage requires structural reform to policies and reparation for hundreds of years of human rights abuses that lay on the foundation of slavery in America. The challenge is to reveal the history, to acknowledge and to repair past wrongs. The sins of the past are appalling, but the real question for me is, what is the response to the sins of our own time? I welcome the discussion. Thank you so much. Excuse me.
Let's give Martha another round of applause. Thank you so much for such a thorough presentation. My name is Shayla Herndon Edmonds, and I'm a consultant who's had the privilege of working with the Academy and College for a bit over a year now, and in every conversation I'm learning something new about this community and the community that surrounds it, so I'm really grateful to just be in this space. We're going to change gears a little bit and invite members of the Anna Maria Samuel Project to the stage to actually engage in a panel discussion. We want to create a little room for the audience to ask a couple of questions. I have questions, but I don't want them to trump to supersede the questions that you have as a collective. So I'm going to take a moment and ask Jessie Bowman, Michelle Hopkins Lawrence, Felicia Penn, Reverend Dr. Amy Rio, combining words, and Martha Hartley to come to the stage. And if you'll give them some applause, thank you, as they come up. Dr. McGee has already told us about Martha's incredible background and the work that she's done, but I want to take a moment to introduce each of our other panelists, because if I leave it up to them to tell you about themselves, they will totally downplay how amazing they are. So starting with Jessie Bowman. There we go. Jessie is a Salem College graduate from the class of 2018. She majored in history and minored in English and race and ethnicity studies. She is currently in her final semester of the Library and Information Science Master's Program at UNC Greensboro. Jessie was a member of the History Committee for the Academy and College in 2017 and has been a member of the Anna Maria Samuel Project since 2018. She's currently interning with Martha and the Hidden Town Project and researching connections between Salem Academy and College and the Happy Hill community in the early 20th century. And I can also add that she is the primary reason that we are in this room tonight, so I'm grateful for her leadership and partnership. Next, Ms. Michelle Hopkins Lawrence has been an Academy history teacher since 2015. She co-chaired the first history committee for the Academy and College in 2017 and has worked with each successive committee. Currently, she is the co-chair of the Anna Maria Samuel Project, as you've heard, and she's also the co-chair of the history committee for the 250th celebration. Since 2017, she has conducted summer research into Salem's history with slavery and all things related to the 250th celebration. As part of this work, she has written an addendum focusing on the experiences of African Americans and Cherokees at Salem for the new reprint of Francis Griffin's 1979 History of the School, Less Time for Meddling. Next, Felicia Penn is the Director of Student Activities at Salem Academy, which educates 9th through 12th grade students. She's also a member of the Anna Maria Samuel Project since 2018. In addition, Felicia serves as a faculty advisor for the Academy's Black Student Union, and she's an Academy alumna for the class of 2003 and a Winston-Salem native. And last but not least, Reverend Dr. Amy Rio has been the chaplain for the Academy and College since 2007. She's an Asheville native, I didn't know that, who received her Bachelor's of Arts from Greensboro College, her Master's of Divinity from Duke Divinity School, and her Doctor of Ministry from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Her dissertation was titled The Wanted Child, A Spirituality of Adoption, and she's been in collegiate ministry for over 23 years, also having served at UNC Asheville and UNC Greensboro. She's a certified spiritual director who's had several articles and essays published about collegiate ministry, interfaith work, Celtic spirituality, and issues surrounding women and spirituality. She is particularly passionate about working around issues of justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's a mother of 2 young adults, and in her free time, as if she really has any, she enjoys reading, hiking, tennis, and spending time with her friends. Thank you for taking the time to hear a little bit about each one of them. They have put in so much work into this process that even if we walk out of this room with remembrance of their efforts and a little bit more history, or really a lot more history from Martha, then I think we will all have been well served. But we wanted to take a couple of minutes and engage in a conversation. Martha mentioned the start of the Anna Maria Samuel Project, and I wanted to ask one of you to speak to a little bit more to how the committee came into existence, and specifically, what's the significance of Anna Maria in this naming and how this committee came to be? I'm looking at Michelle because I saw her eyes light up, but I don't want to make that feel like I'm putting it on you. But who would like to tell us a little bit more about the committee and the naming?
Well, I think the how it started should be Jesse speaking for the beginning, since it was a student initiative from the college students, and I would be happy to speak about why Anna Maria Samuel.
Okay.
Jesse should begin.
Hi. So, can you hear me okay? All right. So everyone should have gotten a timeline booklet as well for the Anna Maria Samuel project, and if you did it, they're somewhere outside. But in 2017, we had a student protest on campus, which Martha had mentioned in her presentation, really asking for accuracy, transparency, and prioritization of our school's history, specifically our school's history with slavery. And so in 2017, we had created the History Committee for Salem Academy and College, which tried to understand some specific college practices, things that our traditions were based on, specifically with our orientation committee, with different campus traditions, really examining where those came from, why we do them, can we do them better, and specifically looking at how can we figure out who was enslaved on our campus? What is the first place to start? And so that committee, then one of its recommendations when it was finished in 2018 was to create a permanent commission that undertakes this work. And so then the Anna Maria Samuel Project was born. It has gone through a few different names, but I'll let Michelle into why we settled on the Anna Maria Samuel Project, Race, Remembrance, and Reconciliation.
Thanks, Jesse.
So in the original name of the committee, the permanent committee that was recommended by the first committee of 2017, and other recommendations included joining USS, University Studying Slavery, and hiring people like Jesse to do research in the summer and to find out more. Summer after summer, we find out new information. And to partner with Hidden Town as well, and to invite Martha. This is her second time speaking on campus, and we have hosted an event at least once each year. But the original first standing committee was called Legacy of Slavery, right? It was much longer than that. Yeah. Yeah, it went from the History Committee to the Commission on the Legacy of Slavery at Salem Academy and College. And what we found, and each of these committees has always had student as well as academy faculty and college faculty, academy staff and college staff, but college students, including members of student government, have always been represented on the committees. And what the college committee students said was that there were students who thought we were focusing too much on slavery and not telling a more positive or fuller story, and especially ignoring the story of segregation at Salem after slavery ended. And because of that, we knew we had to have a new name. And there are other schools who will name their projects for enslaved people that they knew were connected to the school or built the school. And so we had the idea of choosing an individual, and Anna Maria Samuel, as a girl that we know was given permission to take classes, and that we had evidence that she actually lived with students and did participate in education in the 18th century at Salem. We chose her, and then we chose Race, Remembrance, and Reconciliation because it's bigger than the issue of slavery, it goes to addressing the fuller story, and so far I think that name has worked very well.
Thank you.
Shannon, can I add one thing too? And you saw this from Martha's presentation. It's incredibly important for us to know the names and to say the names. And that was one thing we heard so much from Jesse and other students 4.5 years ago. We want to know the names. And so that's one way we wanted to help honor and remember these individuals, is to say the names whenever we can. And that's one of the primary things that's so important for us.
Absolutely. Thank you all. So tell us a little bit about what was known about Salem's relationship with the institution of slavery when your work started, and the type of research that you had to do and what was available for you. I'm sure that it took some work.
Sure. So before the student protest in 2017, we knew of Anna Maria Samuel. She was in the Single Sisters Museum. That, I think, is about all that we could really confirm. And it seemed that Old Salem had been doing really great research, as you could tell, starting in the 80s and 90s. But we never had seemed to make a connection with that here, specifically with the school's history. Once students started asking questions, starting to really become interested in specifically identifying people who were on our campus, that's when the work started. So we were able to identify more specific details about Anna Maria Samuel herself, partnering with Old Salem and with Bethesda, Historic Bethesda as well, but really then starting to expand the scope. So were there any other enslaved students? Were there any other people who may have been educated here at the school while they were enslaved? We were able to answer that question in 2017 as well. There was one other student, one other person, young girl, who was enslaved, who was admitted to the school. It's unclear as to whether or not she actually attended. But then from there, that brings us to about 2018. And so that was a pretty long process to historic research. You have to travel and go places and double and triple check your facts. So in the summer of 2018, I was hired by then President Sterrett to try and identify as many of the names of enslaved individuals on our campus as possible. At the end of that summer, we had a list of, I think it was between 14 and 15 enslaved individuals that we couldn't name them all, but they were identified. So even if it was, quote, an enslaved woman, we at least still knew that this was a person who was living in the inspector's house or could have been in the girls' boarding school, which is now South Residence Hall. So over the last couple of years, we have sort of expanded that as we have come across names that we've tried to confirm that we have this information correct, as well as, like you mentioned, going further into slavery's legacies. So people who worked at the school during the late 1800s or in the early 1900s, as you saw with Martha's presentation, following these families or these Winston-Salem residents who then continued to work at the school in a segregated community or in a segregated institution. So that has sort of brought us up to the present day, but it's been a very long process, but it started out going person by person, trying to identify the people on campus that we knew were enslaved, because before 2017, we knew of one person.
And I would like to add that working in the archives in 2018, just going page through the ledgers and looking for people, but one of the things that I did find was an article from the early 1950s from the North Carolina Historical Record, and there is a woman who wrote about Betsy and who had seen the ledger. There is a ledger in our archives where it shows clearly that Betsy was valued at $400 on the ledger of the school account books. And reading from 1950, Lucy Wenhold, I believe I said her name correctly, that she wrote about this woman in a footnote. So it was known, but I don't think it was something that the school focused on. And certainly in the history of the school, Less Time for Meddling, There is no mention of Betsy. There is no mention of Abraham, Sam, Katie, Lewis. They're not included in that story. That book's focus was not on slavery. So one thing that we've been able to do is look back over the records, things that were known years ago but not published very well. And also we found an actual sales receipt from 1817, and the date leads us to believe that it's actually Betsy. Her name's not on the sales receipt, but it was really clear that there was an idea that Salem didn't participate in slavery. And the Moravians, if you're a local Moravian, you know that the idea was that the Moravians were against slavery, when in fact they participated very much in slavery, even though they did have some rules about spiritual equality. When it came down to it, legally you were not free. And so it was very clear when we found this loose piece of paper that was a sales receipt that the school paid off a debt to the store in town, and they paid it off by transferring the ownership of this girl.
Thank you, Michelle and Jesse. So I have another question, and I'm looking at the time before I ask that question. Does anyone in the audience have a question for our panel?
This is just a quick one, but are the archives like up in the library? I feel like there were archives.
The lower level of the library now, but yes, and some of our materials are in the Moravian archives of the Southern Province, but there is a great deal in the lower level of the library.
Thank you. One more question? Going once.
Did Bethlehem, Pennsylvania also have slaves? I mean, okay.
Yes. So I know that we should have planned 2 hours for this conversation so we could go deeper, and I apologize in hindsight that we did not do that. 2 things I want to ask. One, in a number of responses you said students asked or students said. So I would love to hear from you all, particularly as faculty and administrators, how you brought this history into your 9-to-5 or your other jobs and roles that you have at Salem, and what that's looked like. I know that there's classes and other things, but how are students learning about this in real time, even before the 250th?
So more of what's coming into the classroom is bringing the idea of diversity, especially with all the knowledge that we've gained from Anna Maria and then all the other people who we just uncovered and found out about their histories. So last year in term, we did a big push at the academy as far as learning about racism in America, learning about historical figures that we may have not known the full background about their decisions or what happened in context to the different historical events. So having those conversations and discussions within the classroom, whether it was teacher-led or even student-led, just to have that open air to discuss, well, what does this mean or how does this concept affect me, is kind of how we kind of kept the ball rolling and started last year. I know for me in student activities, I manage, well not manage, I advise as a Black Student Union, and especially in high school, they're at that age where I'm trying to figure out who I am. What does it mean to be African American? What does it mean to be Latinx? What does it mean to be blank? So a lot of our conversations talks about racial disparity, or recently is talking about voting rights and voting suppression. So it's a lot of open conversations and having the history of Old Salem and also just the history of our country and what we're going through currently is kind of how we pull a few of the conversations that happen at school.
And also working with Hidden Town, that so much of Jesse's research came out of internship with Hidden Town, and we've had academy students as well do research with Hidden Town, and that has just been a tremendous educational opportunity, and they've been excited and they've been encouraged to do this because of events like this.
Anyone else have anything to add?
I think on the college side, we are a health leadership institution now, and we know that people of color deal with health disparities and issues. You know, the research shows this. So one of the things that's so important for us as we're looking at being a health leadership institution is looking at issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how we can be a leader and help changing this in our society, in our world. And it's something that students are talking about. We are very fortunate here at Salem to have such a large percentage of students who are people of color. And so I really see these kinds of conversations interwoven, you know, throughout all of our courses and our activities and the ways that we are existing in community together. And I think it's exciting that Salem is really not just trying to learn history, but to talk about ways that it impacts our world today and then how we can help shape the future.
So you gave me a perfect segue into my last question, which is, what are your hopes for this work moving forward? And so you already spoke to that, Reverend Dr. Rio, but others here, Martha, Michelle, Felicia, Jesse, what are your hopes for the work moving forward, and what does remembering look like?
Sure. So we, as a committee, do our best, but we also, like you said, have other full-time jobs. So I think that going forward, having this work continue to be an institutional priority is something that's really important to me as an alum. We do this without a budget, so it can be often difficult to navigate that. So I would love to see, specifically also looking to other institutions who are similar to us who have done this work. I'm thinking of Hollins University specifically. They have done an excellent job of extending into their local community, working with the historic Black community that neighbors their campus, and making those really important connections. They have a scholarship for descendants of enslaved people who are at their school. So I think looking outside of our institution, seeing how we can become better neighbors to the people around us, and really making sure that this work is continuous and priority is something that I am really interested in.
Thank you, Jesse.
I think we're on the reconciliation phase of the committee, and not to say that the first two aren't important, but I think to be active and growing and to grow as a community, the reconciliation phase is probably the most important. The external part is definitely, to go to Jesse's point, is really important piece of the whole program, but I think also internally to make sure that we are reconciling how we are teaching our kids, how we're conducting ourselves in the classroom, what does our institutional structure looks like as far as diversity, as far as making sure there's equity among just students, faculty and staff, just across the board. So I think taking the knowledge that we know from all of our studies and applying that both internally and externally is how we move forward.
Thank you, Felicia.
And I would like to add one thing, is that we remember that our student body turns over every 4 years. And so that events like this, as I said, this is Martha's second time coming to us, and I learn something new every time I see Martha speak. I think it's so important that we continue to do once a year some sort of program, because we have to remember we need to keep teaching our students as they come in and learn this story from the beginning. And we also have many faculty and staff who are new, or who have been here a while but haven't heard this yet. And so I think continuing the education is important.
I've said a lot, so I don't want to intrude, but I would just add that knowing the history, the truth in history is so important. And I find when I speak to groups in Winston-Salem, people don't know our history. So it's really important to know the history, because you can't care unless you understand why we're where we are today. So I would say yes, exactly. Educate and be active in the community and engage your students.
Thank you, Martha. And so to you,
I'm sorry, can I add one more thing? So, I think we can see we all feel so passionately about this work, and we could talk about it much longer, but I think the one thing that I really do want to add is ritual. is what's important. I mean, I am a spiritual specialist here with the Academy of the College, but ritual is how we're going to work towards reconciliation, which Felicia's been talking about. With the walking tour, which Jesse has organized for Friday, it's a ritual. And this ritual is a sacred act which transforms us from who we've been to who we want to be in the future and who we are called to be and living the most authentically that we can. And so really focusing, continuing to do our research, to do all these wonderful things that we're talking about, but focusing on these sacred acts which are going to transform